Okay, today is 2019, December 11th. We're with Roger Paolo. I am Sandy Hallam, and we are doing an oral history. And we are going to start off with, first of all, Roger, tell me a little bit about your earliest life, where you were born and how you came into Kent.
Okay, I was actually born in Ravenna, and we lived in what was called a Wilson home on the fairgrounds. And I was born in June 1955. We lived there until July of 1956. My mother was pregnant with her second child in 14 months, and she didn't drive, and Ravenna was a nice place. She made a lot of friends there, but she felt kind of isolated. So we moved to Kent, and in July 1956 we moved to 1237 Shelton Drive. That home was built by my grandfather, Agostino Siciliano, and that was where my mom's parents lived. And it was basically a family compound. My grandfather, in the late 1940s, had bought an entire block of what was then Franklin Township. When we moved in, it was not part of Kent. My dad helped pass petitions for the annexation in 1959, but he owned the block that was Shelton Drive, bounded by Laurel Drive and Brentwood Drive, and he had the main house on the hill at 1237. Next door was one of my uncles. Later, he and my grandmother built what we called the Pink House on Brentwood Drive, and next to them lived my Aunt Elda and Uncle Sam, and across from them lived my Uncle Tilly and Aunt Marie. And I joke that I didn't know what a boundary line was till I was 8 years old when we moved to Norwood Street. It literally was an idyllic childhood. The only time I ever remember being unhappy was when my dad told us we were going to move, and that was 1963.
And why did you move?
Quite frankly, I think he didn't enjoy living in his in-laws' backyard. And what's kind of funny, that year all of us got new houses, or different houses, and my aunt moved to 1237, where she lived until she died in 2015. My cousin Diane is living there now. That house has been in the family for 70 years. This will be the 70th Christmas there.
Let me talk a little bit about, since you're talking about this Italian compound, when did your family, as the Italian families, come to this area?
My mom's parents settled in Kent in 1914, and they settled in the South End because, frankly, it was cheap but decent housing, and Italian folks weren't allowed to live beyond the South End. It was unwritten, although there were deed restrictions on some properties that they couldn't have afforded anyway. But they lived in the South End until 1949, so they were there for, I don't know, do the math, but my mom was one of 10 children. She was the first one born at 144 West Summit, which they owned from 1925 until 1949.
Did the family work with the railroad then?
My grandfather came to Kent. He originally had settled in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and he came to Kent to work with the Erie. He worked in the rail yards off of Lake Street. The car shops were considered skilled labor. The rail yards basically were paid a decent wage, and you didn't have to speak English or know it. He learned English by going to night classes at South School, where they had Americanization classes.
They did?
Yes.
Interesting. So that's your mother's family, correct?
That's my mother's family.
Where was your father's family from?
My father's family settled in Bel Air, Ohio, which is on the Ohio River, really kind of across from Wheeling. And most of that area was coal mining. Bel Air at one time was larger than the city of Kent. It dwindled to, it's lost its city status 20 years ago. It's now a village. My grandfather was a shoe repairman. He had briefly gone to Detroit. He lasted one day on the assembly line for Ford. And as for coal mining, he told my dad and my uncle, I would rather see you rob a bank than be a coal miner. All the other Italian fathers worked in the mines, and they were comparatively wealthy. My grandparents were poor. They were poor their entire lives. You don't make much charging 50 cents to do a pair of shoes. My grandfather was not my dad's birth father. He was the brother of his birth father. His birth father died when my father was 3 months old. He had chronic lung issues. He had been gassed at the Battle of Cabaretto. My dad was born on New Year's Day, 1925. His father died on March the 25th that year.
So he fought on the
Italian
on
Army,
the Italian
on
side.
the Italian Army side.
And where were the families from in Italy?
Okay, my dad's family is from Abruzzi, which is sort of like south central Italy. My mom's family was from Calabria, and even though their name was Siciliano, I was told very adamantly by my grandmother, we are not Sicilian. I can remember telling my kindergarten teacher at Longcoy that my grandmother was from the tip of the boot, because it's Paolo is right across from the Straits of Messina, but you know, it's like an Ohioan versus a West Virginian. It's like they're very proud that they weren't Sicilian.
As you started to go to school, and tell me a little bit about what it was like going to your early years in elementary and middle school.
My first exposure to Kent schools was kindergarten at Longcoy School. And Longcoy in 1960 was the newest school in Kent. It had been built 5 years earlier. And I was so blessed to have Gladys Montgomery be my introduction to education. She was wonderful. She was ahead of her times. You know, she literally embodied the idea of kindergarten being a child's garden. You know, she could discipline kids just by literally raising her voice just a little bit. I have nothing but good memories, and it's funny, I'm still in touch with a lot of my classmates from 60 years ago. We all love Mrs. Montgomery. She was wonderful. Years later, when I was working at the paper, I spoke to the Women's Club of Kent, and she, by that time, was pretty elderly, and she introduced me, and she recalled a story that I didn't remember, that she had sent me to the office with a note for somebody, and I had come back to the classroom and said, Mrs. Montgomery, you could have just told me to ask Mrs. Wright this, and this. I had read the note, and she didn't know that I could read. And she said, well, next time I'll just tell you, you don't have to bring the note. But she was wonderful. She was absolutely delightful. And I was so proud that I nominated her for the Kent Hall of Fame, and she got in, and her son was there, and her sister was there, and she's a wonderful lady. So she was a great introduction to education, but my parents, being good Catholics in the 60s, opted to send us to St. Pat's. Even though Longcoy literally was within walking distance, and St. Pat's entailed busing. We used to be bused home. We had the last route from St. Pat's. We wouldn't get home till 4:30. The bus route started in the south end and swung around to the west side of Kent. So I knew Pine Street and Harris Street and Elm Street when I was like 6 years old. St. Pat's I have very, very mixed feelings about. I had an absolutely hateful first grade teacher who, if I put her name up on Facebook, it opens a floodgate of bad memories. This is 60 years later, and we do have PTSD. And the only things people remember are awful memories. She was physically abusive. She was emotionally...
Was she a nun?
She was a nun. She was emotionally abusive. We just witnessed horrible things and never told our parents because we were afraid we were next. So that was an awful way to start school. Second grade teacher, I literally don't remember anything but her name. Third grade teacher was Sister Mary Coleman, who looked like Ingrid Bergman in the Bells of St. Mary's. And she is still alive. She's in her 80s, and she is still beautiful. That was the teacher that I had when President Kennedy was killed. And so she's always part of that memory. Fourth grade teacher was a man named Bob Woodseck, who died very unexpectedly at the end of the school year. And of course, nobody ever told us how he died, so there's all sorts of rumors. Fifth grade was Mary Herrick, who looked like Irene Ryan. She loved me, and I loved her. She had a horrible smoker's cough and lung cancer killed her. But she was a really nice lady. The other teacher was Mrs. DeLone. That was Hazel. Hazel had blue hair and she drenched herself in white shoulder. If she was walking in the hall, you could like smell her 10 minutes later. And people, that's their memory. 6th grade was Sister Krista, who I don't have that many memories of. 7th was Sister Maureen Smith, and she taught, by that time, St. Pat's, when I was there, peaked their enrollment with 805 students in 1964. My 4th grade class had 46 kids in it, and there were 3 4th grade classes of equal size. By the time the late 60s hit, the enrollment had dropped substantially. It actually dropped substantially after that 805 when parents didn't want their kids with 40 other kids. So they only had one 7th grade class. I think there were about 40 of us, and Sister Maureen Smith taught it. Sister Maureen was, at the time was known as Sister Sheila. She was Irish and proud, and she had an Irish temper, and she played the guitar. And, I have generally good memories of her. She didn't take any nonsense. She loved my dad. My mom was scared of her. And then 8th grade was Sister Christina, who by that time I was really dealing with like being a teenager and was emotional, and it's like I didn't enjoy her, and I was really glad I got out of school. So that would have been, the church in 1961 was a totally different institution than it was in 1969. And, it was very, very traditional, and then Vatican II took place in 62 and 63, and by 69, the nuns weren't wearing habits anymore, they were strumming guitars. I met Denver Brunel, my dear friend, in 6th grade, where she would come in and play the guitar for us. I remember Father Zima in 5th grade coming in with the guitar, playing Sounds of Silence. And, we also dealt at that time with priests that were leaving the priesthood, which was unheard of, leaving the priesthood to get married. We had Vietnam taking its toll. The first teacher that I knew that was adamantly against Vietnam was Eileen Roth, my 6th grade teacher, who basically gave us the other side of the story that I wasn't hearing at home. And she was interesting because she was Jewish.
And she was at the Catholic school?
She was at the Catholic school. And I got into contact with her a couple years ago, and she said, "Your school was very progressive. No one ever made my religion an issue. She taught under a crucifix. The only thing she didn't do was teach religion. And she taught us Gilbert and Sullivan songs and labor songs and red diaper baby songs, and I teased her about that. I said, you had to explain to us what a company store was when she said she did 16 tons. But it was interesting. It was a very, very diverse, it was basically, they were Catholic kids. I was a lawyer's son, so we were considered, upper class. I went to school with kids from the South End. There were kids from Brady Lake. It probably at the time was the most diverse school in Kent. And, all told, my memories are mixed. If I could erase some of the bad ones, the good ones there's more good ones than bad ones.
Now in Kent, it's always been interesting that when you go to Standing Rock Cemetery, you have a Catholic part of the cemetery. Yes. And the rest. Could you explain?
The Catholic part of the cemetery literally was a separate cemetery known as St. Patrick's Cemetery. Catholics believe that you have to be buried in consecrated ground. St. Patrick's Cemetery was established, I think, in the 1860s. Prior to that, if you were a Catholic that died in Portage County and you wanted to be buried in consecrated ground, you're buried at St. Joe's in Randolph, because there was nothing. And then the Immaculate Conception opened its own cemetery. St. Peter's in Richtown opened its own cemetery, and Kent operated its. They operated their cemetery independently, although they had a contract with the sexton for 100 years. And then the diocese really wanted to get out of the cemetery business, other than the diocesan cemeteries that they owned in St. Pat's basically deeded over whatever its rights were to the cemetery in exchange for perpetual maintenance by Standing Rock, which made sense. Standing Rock is, it in the 60s, when Genver Bennell's husband died, he was not buried in the St. Pat's side because he was Protestant. And Genver remembered going to make arrangements for him, and this is a widow with 3 children and one on the way, and being asked, what's your religion? And she said, well, I'm Catholic. Well, what was your husband? And she said it was Protestant. They said, oh, you're mixed. We'll put him here. The cemetery is also de facto segregated. There's an entire section behind the mausoleum that's African American. The only African Americans that are buried in St. Pat's are the Tompkinses and the Browns because they were Catholics. But yeah,
And now with the cemetery at Sandy Rock, you can be buried anywhere, as far as I know.
to the best of my knowledge, yeah.
That's interesting. Also, what were attitudes about your being Catholic and your family being Catholic? The Catholic, when the Kent family gave all the land for the churches, they were all in a row except the Catholics, which were over on the other side of town.
Yeah.
Do you think that was part of the feeling about Catholics at that time?
I think it was part of the feeling. My mom talked about being called a mackerel snapper. Yeah. And my grandfather remembered the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses, and one of the places they burned a cross was from across the street from St. Pat's Church and School on Portage Street. So there was definitely prejudice, maybe not particularly spoken, but at times unspoken. And Catholics, I think, by their nature were clannish. I can remember in kindergarten, we would say, a little thank you prayer before we ate our snack. And I can remember really wondering, should I be saying this or not? Is this a Protestant prayer? It definitely was there. And it's like when people talk about prayer in schools, I experienced it. I said it. But even at 5 years old, I kind of wondered, should I be doing this? And of course, you don't have any choice.
Right.
But I think there was prejudice to an extent. The Catholics, I think, in Kent are very clannish. This was an era in the 50s and the 60s of huge families. The Michaels had 10 kids, the Harts had 10 kids, the Fishers had 8 or 10 kids, and the Kleins had 14 kids. And Protestants didn't do that.
Right.
So there was a difference. Catholics were kind of considered out of the mainstream in that they sent their kids to this old dilapidated school rather than going to the new schools all over Kent. So it was, there's definitely a differentiation.
And then came high school.
Okay, we have 9th grade at Davie Junior High, which was, quite frankly, was a miserable year. I went from a class of about 20 kids at St. Pat's to this huge building where I was overwhelmed. And it wasn't a pleasant year. The thing I remember is that's where I was when May 4th took place. I was, out in a gym class. We were out on the track. But that wasn't a wonderful year. I did have a wonderful English teacher, Juliet Grimsley, who recognized that I was like totally lost and just said, for every book that you do a report on, I'll give you 100%. So I read 84 books that year. Yeah. And she was an English major. She knew just about every one I had read. It's like I would read it and I said, well, I finished this, just I need a character sketch on so-and-so, and only 2 pages. And, so she was wonderful. But other than that, I don't have really good memories. Roosevelt actually started out rough because in my sophomore year, I had a ruptured appendix with peritonitis, which landed me in the hospital, and they didn't diagnose it for 6 days. So, and that kind of was like a life-changing thing. It's like you're 15 years old and you're getting a mortality call. But recovered from that. it was it was a really good education. I had some wonderful, wonderful teachers. As I, progressed into junior and senior year, I had a lot of fun. And I had, teachers, like Charlene Bongiorno was my journalism teacher. And Carol Allport taught me French. Glenn Ludick taught me chemistry, and he taught me that and I was terrible in chemistry. And he said, if you can just write up your mistakes and tell me what went wrong, that's fine. I hated gym class. Dave Grossi was wonderful my senior year. It's like, okay, if you show up and get dressed and stay out of the way, I'll give you a B. And Jolie Griffin and I we first signed up for archery. And we go to the archery field, and Kathy Chris is doing archery with these targets and arrows, and Jolie looked at me and she goes, we could seriously get hurt back here. She goes, we've got to get out of this. So we went to the guidance office, and Mike Hardy was there, and Jolie said, let me do all the talking, which she was very good at. And she says, Mr. Hardy, we just can't do this. We're fearful for our safety. And he goes, oh, well, how about recreational games? How does that sound? She goes, well, if it doesn't involve sharp objects, I think we'll take that. So we ended up in Dave Grossi's recreational games class, totally bummed out of volleyball. He said, because I can't believe you don't know how to play volleyball. And it's like, well, I guess I don't. So we spent that year, getting dressed, going to gym class, and literally playing checkers. That was the recreational game, and it's like, that's what I did. I didn't need to take a shower, and so that was kind of fun. Ken Gesford was like my best teacher. He was more into teacher.
And that was art. And you did learn to love art then. And how about your writing? Is that when you discovered your passion for writing in high school?
I think Charlene Bongiorno's journalism class, because she was very liberal about what I could write and what I could tackle. And my friend Brian Cochran and I operated the so-called underground newspaper. It was called Volunteers, and it was mimeographed. And we tackled the war. We had other students that were, tackling the so-called issues of the day at the school, and we had a lot of fun.
So you had an actual newspaper that you were putting out?
We mimeographed it, yeah.
And they let you distribute it?
They let us distribute it. We weren't censored. They basically paid for the paper and allowed us to use a mimeograph machine. But basically, we didn't have any oversight from anybody.
Did you ever do anything controversial with it?
Actually, what I did was moderately controversial was with the Kernel, which was the student newspaper. And I had, I was fascinated by Doonesbury, so I had a Doonesbury-style cartoon. And it was Mr. Neal, the principal, doing his Christmas list with Dr. Stanton, and it's like, come sit on my lap. And Charlene censored that, and I was so mad at her, and she goes, look, you don't have my job. She goes, it's like, I give you a lot of rope, but I'm not going to let you hang yourself. So that was the thing. And and I have in my scrapbook, I have the original cartoon and the censored version of the cartoon. But
so is at that point that you started, had you considered thinking of yourself as a journalist before this?
No, what's funny is when I got out of Roosevelt, I wanted to be an artist. And that lasted when, I was at Oberlin for a semester and 2 weeks. And being an artist went right out the window because I couldn't create on demand. It's like, I was taking a painting and drawing class, and it's like, I want 25 drawings by this time next week. And it's like, oh my God, I can't do that on demand. I have to be inspired. So that didn't work. And journalism was like kind of a fourth choice. It's like I had 4 majors. It's like I started in art, that didn't work. Started in English, which I loved until I was reading 80 and 90 pages a night. And it's like, oh God, this was fun, but it's like, this is like all consuming. History I love, that was the 3rd major, and then by that time I really wasn't liking Kent State, and it's like, I'm never going to get a job with this history degree. So, it came down to, I want something that'll get me out of here within 5 years and that I can find a job with a bachelor's, and it was journalism.
What did your parents think of your bouncing around in majors?
They were generally supportive. Henry, at Oberlin, I remember, Oberlin I realized wasn't the 13th grade of Roosevelt, and I was totally overwhelmed. And I had a philosophy class that just baffled the hell out of me. I can remember the professor was a really, really nice guy, and he was speaking about the concept of essence, and I was so clueless, I was writing everything down, and he had his foot on a chair, and he said, when we're talking about essence, he goes, we're talking about the chairness of this chair. And I remember writing down chairness of the chair and thinking, oh hell, this is absurd. So I somehow managed to get a C in that class. And I remember, my dad looking at the report card, and the others were like B's, and I think there was like 1A, I think it was in history. And, he never liked the C on the report card. He goes, well, if you're going to get a C or a D or flunk anything, I'm glad it's philosophy, because you won't end up weaving baskets in Vermont.
This is your father.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
At that point, when you started at Kent State, was your father then still a lawyer or a judge?
He didn't become a judge until it was 1987. So
Okay,
he was still a lawyer.
And what year did you enter Kent State?
Entered Kent State on June 24th, 1974, because my mother had breast cancer surgery the same day.
Wow.
And I'll never forget that. But I started in the summer. I had spent I quit Oberlin very abruptly in February 1974. We were getting ready to go back. I told my dad, I'm not going back. So what do you mean? Do you feel sick? No, I don't feel sick. I'm just not going back. And thank God he was incredibly understanding. Although years later, there was non-refundable tuition, and that was like about $2,500 in 1974. And he said, I could have sent you on a trip to Paris for a month with that money. And I said, I wish you had. So that was February. I spent the next 4 months just doing nothing at home with my mom. I watched my mom clean the house. I watched her vacuum. I followed her from room to room and talked with her. I remember my dad coming home one afternoon. He said, what'd you do today? I said, nothing. He goes, do you enjoy doing nothing? I go, yeah, I really do. He goes, you're pretty good at doing nothing, aren't you? And I go, yeah. He goes, well, guess what? You can't do nothing for a career. You have a choice. You either get yourself a job or you go to Kent State this summer. So not wanting to work, I ended up at Kent State. And, and finally got my degree in, I think, 5 years.
In journalism?
Ultimately in journalism. Ultimately, it was after English and history. And it was like, oh God, I got to get something to get out of here.
Okay, so you get this degree and then you get a job?
I get a job, and basically I needed an internship, and I didn't want to leave home. So it's like, okay, my dad knew David Dix, and I had gone to school with David's little sister, Chris. So, I kind of was aware of David and his dad, and I went over and interviewed that April for an internship, and everything worked out, and I ended up being assigned to the Kent office to work for Loris Troyer, who lived down the street 3 houses away, so I knew him. And I was hired at $2.75 an hour, and I stayed for 40 years.
You were an intern for 4 years?
I stayed for 40 years.
Right.
I was an intern for the summer, and then they said, oh, we'll keep you on, because it was covering the gym dispute.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
So then you morphed in, and then did you stay in the Kent office then?
I stayed in the Kent office. I was in the Kent office until 1991.
When they closed.
Yeah. So from covering the university for about a year and a half, I covered the city for 3 years and became assistant city editor in 81 and city editor in 82. But it was a lot of fun.
What during those years from your growing up, looking at the tremendous changes that happened in the 60s and 70s in the community, What are some of your thoughts about how the town changed?
I think there was an incredible transformation. Growing up in the early 60s, Kent was a classic small town. You had a bank and 3 drugstores on the corner. You had the big building that burned down in 1972 that had Purcell's and Junior Fashions, where my mom used to buy my school clothes. She did, the drugstore. We get our prescriptions filled from Dr. Lang by Jim Myers and Charlie Young at Thompson's. Across the street was John Carson at Donaghy's, who my parents knew, who my mom knew from Roosevelt. I ended up doing our banking, or doing my banking at Huntington, which was then Portage National. My 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Herrick, used to let me walk from St. Pat's to Portage National to cash her paycheck. And I thought that was pretty neat, and I remember she sent me down to Klein's Market with a $100 bill to pay on her food bill. And, and it was, you talk about ultimate trust. And, it was basically to get me out of the classroom because I was bored. So, when I was in 5th grade, I opened my own savings account at Portage National. My dad used to do all his banking in Ravenna. So, so you had that. I think the other thing, too, is the downtown merchants in the 60s. Everybody knew each other, and they lived in Kent, which means you went to school with their kids. I went to school with Lisa and Johnny Carson. The Kleins had kids in every possible grade. I went to school with Julia.
And they had the market.
The market, yeah. They had the market.
And then there was the Longcoy.
Longcoy was out, but what's funny is Klein's Market had Klein's, it had Wise's Bar. I went to school with Joe Wise, who was the grandson of the owner. It had Friedland's Shoe Store, and that was Lou and Gert Friedland. And next door was the Style Center, which was Hy Friedland, and his wife's name was Lena, but she was known as Sorky. Everybody called her Sorky Friedland. And Dr. Kavar was their nephew, and he had his practice a couple storefronts away. Friedland's was great. I had jumping jack shoes until I was probably 12. We would go in there. Lou Friedland loved to talk politics with my dad. And they were both extreme liberals. And Gert Friedland just, what are we going to do about Hubert Humphrey? And she literally would say, but is it good for the Jews? And they were delightful to talk.
And there were not very many Jews.
There weren't very many Jews that lived in Kent.
And they had a few storefronts.
You had a few storefronts, but the Friedlands, Lou and Hy and their wives lived in Akron. Next to Lou's store was Marv's Shoe Store, which was orthopedic shoes, and Marv was Lou and Gert's. He was married to their daughter. I think he lived in Stowe. But it was very, very close knit. You had, the Butcher Boy Meats was there.
Sparkle Grocery.
Sparkle Market, that was the Ferraras. The Christian Science Reading Store, which always fascinated me. That's part of Woodsy's now. And Kent Jewelry was with, Mr. Szabo and his daughter Sylvia, who became one of my friends. Davy Tree was downtown. You had a lot of people downtown. It was not unusual to be caught in a parking jam. I can remember driving home from Kent State one afternoon and being stuck at the top of the lot where the theater was because there was a train on the tracks. If you lived on the west side, you factored in 20 minutes to get to the east side of Kent because you didn't want to get stuck by a train. I can still remember my dad taking us to St. Pat's, and he got to the top of the hill at the Masonic Temple and saw a train coming and zoomed across and went down Gogler Avenue to hit Manway Street to hit the Crane Avenue Bridge. And the train had gotten there, and not only that, the train had parked there, stopped, and was backing up. And and I think we were late. I also remember being on the original Crane Avenue Bridge. We were on that the night before it collapsed. We bought our Christmas tree from Bill Ruggieri on Marvin Avenue. The bridge scared me because it was bumpy, it was rumbly, it vibrated, it had a wooden floor, and the next morning it fell in, and that was
What year was that?
That was December 18th, 1964. It was 1 week before Christmas.
Wow.
There were kids at St. Pat's that had walked across that bridge to go to school that morning. There were 3 high school students walking to Roosevelt that were on the bridge when it collapsed. They ended up in the water. There was a older man who had driven his wife to Streetsboro High School to teach. He was on the bridge and he was behind the truck that collapsed it, and he was killed. He drowned. But I definitely remember that bridge.
So then we get into the 70s, and even the period of time around May 4th, 69 and 70, when there were definitely things from Kent State coming downtown, there were.
Oh yeah.
How did things seem as if they were changing between the chemistry of Kent State and the town?
What I remember with both of my parents, they were very proud of Kent State. Even though my mom never set foot there until she worked there after she was divorced, she was proud of Kent State. That was their university. And when May 4th came along, they felt like that was a slap at the people of Kent. But I can remember going to a campus day parade, and it would have been about 1968, and there was a group of protesters that kind of barged their way into the parade, and they were wearing gas masks and marching in the parade, and everybody knew, oh my God, this isn't like a fraternity. So there was definitely that. I had a next door neighbor who worked at what was a glorified head shop. It was called Parallels, and it was on Franklin Avenue across from where the farmer's market is. It's torn down now. It's the vacant lot next to College Avenue. And she sold allegedly incense and herbs and all this stuff. But I had to laugh. My son Brian, years ago, we were in downtown Kent, and a couple of college students passed in front of us at the square, and the one had like purple hair. And I forget, the other one was wearing something kind of outlandish and didn't faze him at all. And all says, were there hippies when you were growing up? And it's like, yeah, as a matter of fact, they were. And it's like I said, some of the people you go to church with at the Unitarian Church were hippies. So, I can remember when the Yippies had a picnic at Fred Fuller Park. And I remember our bus going past that, and it was, it was kind of like, oh, there's something going on down there. So it was definitely filtering in. I mean, there was definitely part of the counterculture. I can remember a couple of head shops. And again with the war, the St. Pat's had a peace vigil it's either 1968 or 1969, and they were basically Catholics praying for an end of the war. And you had a delegation of people not praying for the end of the war who came in. They were led by a lawyer, not my dad, who basically tore up their pamphlets and scattered them in the aisle of the church and left. The priest at St. Pat's was Monsignor Koch, who was incredible. He's an incredible theologian. He's an incredibly brilliant man. He marched in Selma. He had the audacity to be very adamant about the war being immoral. And basically the congregation froze him out. They stopped giving money in the collection basket, and he left in 1971 and got married.
Now, in the 70s, the city of Kent, after the shootings and also because so many small towns were like this, as the outside malls became built, what happened to downtown Kent in those years?
The worst thing that happened to downtown Kent was the fire in 1972, which demolished an entire block, and it is an entire block of thriving businesses. And because it was owned by multiple owners, they couldn't get their act together. The city had a mayor who was less than aggressive. The city did nothing in terms of economic development, in terms of like maybe actually buying that plot and, fostering a new development there. So it basically burned down an entire block, which to this day is vacant. It's got a good use now. It's a good gathering place, but basically they let 136 years of history burn and not be replaced. When River Block 1 burned in Ravenna in 1991, the first thing that they did was, we will rebuild.
Mhm.
And it wasn't much, the damage to that was pretty severe too. I think the fire at the Kent Block, 1973, the fire at Hans, 1975, the fires on North Water Street. The joke used to be, if you want to see your neighbors, go downtown when there's a fire. I mean, I can remember everybody went downtown in 1972. That was a week before I started my senior year. And, everybody was down there taking pictures. Everybody was talking to everybody, looking at the rubble, looking at the ruins. And, Kent State didn't want anything to do with Kent. The city was still under a strong mayor government, which was basically, a strong mayor was a popular mayor, which didn't mean he was particularly qualified. There was no direction. Kent stagnated. Businesses dropped off. I remember writing a column for the Courier in 1979 projecting, I don't know how many years ahead, and saying the last retail business in downtown Kent closed today and nobody noticed. And it was business after business that dropped off. McCrory's Five and Dime went out of business in 1979. I'm surprised it survived as much. I wrote a feature about what people wouldn't buy for 90% off.
What moved you to become kind of a Kent's self-styled historian?
I think, Henry, a lot of that was Loris Troyer's influence. Loris encouraged me. Loris retired in 1982. Prior to his retirement, I had the idea that I was going to write yesteryears, where I was going to read microfilm and regurgitate it on a weekly basis. And we were coming into Loris, and he said, "That's a great idea." He goes, "But remember, you've made a commitment, and you've got to carry this through." Well, I did it for 36 years. When I left the Courier, that was the longest running regular feature. And reading, I would read 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, 100 years ago. I ultimately read every paper from 1906 on. And you pick up a lot of information that way. Loris was wonderful to work with, and he was great at putting things into perspective. I can remember the morning that the American Legion building burned down on South River Street. Sandy Bullock covered the fire. She came into the newsroom and she sits down and she's reeking of smoke, and she looks at Laura. She goes, "Troyer, my dry cleaning bill could be sent to you." But she wrote the fire story. Loris, meanwhile, wrote the sidebar that was Zenas Kent's home, and it was one of the earliest homes in Kent. And he did it all without researching it, because he just knew it. And I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
When he retired, I basically became kind of the institutional memory of Kent. I moved over to being editor in 1991, and there were things I gave up, like doing the religion page, which I didn't want to do anyway. But I took over the editorial page. I took over writing editorials. I did the history column, and then Loris, as he got older, decided, well, I'll just recycle the Portage Pathways. And I didn't want to rerun columns. And I said, it's like, why don't you let me write? Well, you do whatever you want, just as long as there's something up there. So I started writing Pathways in 2002, and I kept those up for almost 15 years. And you learn a great deal. But I would credit Loris. David Dix also was very encouraging. I wrote 2 books on company time, and they were basically compilations of history columns. The proceeds were all donated because I couldn't accept any money for it. But, he didn't mind me sitting in front of a microfilm for like 2 hours to do research and maybe an hour to write the column. There were others in the administration that thought it was a waste of time, and fortunately David would run interference. But I think Loris made a big, big difference.
Were you ever censored by the paper in anything you wrote, or did you always have free reign?
The only thing that I was censored by, and it wasn't by David, it was his cousin Chuck, who was acting publisher in David's absence. I had written a column cascading the city council for conducting interviews for a council vacancy behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And Chuck didn't want to run it, and I think Chuck was just being overly cautious because David wasn't around. That was the only thing.
Were
But-
you, did you see, we talked about the strong mayor.
Yeah.
A lot of people, there was a lot of conflict over changing the
Yeah.
strong mayor to the city manager.
Well,
And you were right ringside for that.
that was shortly before I started. That was 1975, but Sandy Bullock covered the transition in 1977, and I took over in 1978. But actually, the first week I took over, the original manager was fired because he just wasn't a good fit. And then there were at least 2 other attempts to bring the strong mayor back, to to repeal the manager's thing, and finally people seemed to accept it. My old friend Bob Hart, the law director, said the single best argument for a city manager was Joe Saboro, because he was such a bad mayor.
Yes.
And and I think things get personalized. I covered some phenomenal councils. I mean, the council that I covered that had Pat Reed and Walt Adams, and actually, Barb Watson was on it. Bob Sullivan.
Jerry Lewis was,
He was later.
Yeah.
But that would have been the council. 1978 or 1979. They were very, very progressive. Bill Schultz came onto the council. Planning Commission had Helen Gregory, Tom Walters, and a couple of other, very progressive people. Louise Liska. Those were like the 1970s. Kent was really floundering. It would have been in a lot worse shape. You would never have had downtown revitalization if you had had a strong mayor, because that included land banking, which you had to explain to people. We're spending a small fortune not to buy this dilapidated beauty shop, but the land that's under it. And the strong mayor would have caved on that. And I give Jerry Fiala credit. He definitely evolved on that and became one of the biggest boosters of land banking. And Priscilla Blanchard, who doesn't get credit for anything, basically she was the first. But at the same time, I wrote the feature when the hotel closed in 1979, and I remember going through the hotel when the last tenants were there. And then from 1979 for over 20 years, 25 years, it just got worse and worse and worse. And part of it was nobody could get their act together on that. I remember sitting next to Linda Lefton, the president's wife. We were on a leadership portrait expedition. We ended up being lunch partners, and she was a lot of fun. And we were talking about Kent. I said, "How do you like Kent?" She goes, "Well, Lester and I tried it. We take our dry cleaning downtown. We do all our banking downtown. We do as much shopping as we could do downtown." And she just didn't break stride. She goes, "When are they going to do something about that horrible hotel?" And I said, "Oh, Mrs. Lefton, it's been that way for like over 20 years. I don't know if anything's ever going to happen." And she pointed at me and she goes, "That's your problem. You don't see it." She goes, "You know what it's like when we take kids through downtown Kent with their parents, and the first thing they see is a six-story monolith that's rotting." And it's like, wow. And that put it in perspective. But I mean, the hotel was like inaction. It's like, we'll just kind of let it, get worse and worse. And so much of downtown Kent just got worse and worse. It took some people with some guts. I mean, Sue Nelson basically took over Klein's Market. Barrett's put in Citibank Antiques when nobody was shopping in downtown Kent, much less for antiques. Nancy Arthur and Jim Arthur put in the Works, which was like shopping in like 1983. I used to joke with some of my younger reporters after Kent was revitalized. I said, I had lunch here every day from 1977 through 1990. In the early 80s, I could have crossed Main Street and danced in an X and wouldn't have got hit by a car, because there was nothing there.
And then the Historical Society saved the depot,
Yes,
and that was very important to that very dark spot.
I remember very much the depot being boarded up, and this would have been maybe in about 1980, and Chris Myers was on council, and he raised the idea of tearing it down. And Ted Sapp just blew up. Says, don't you dare even do that. He goes, we're not even going to consider it. And it just died. But that was a very, Chris basically spoke what a lot of people thought, because it looked like hell.
So if I'm right in saying this, I think you really talk a lot about the demise during the 70s, which some people marked from the shootings, but I think you really show came from these fires and this lack of leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important. But interestingly enough, now that Kent is thriving, it is because of the partnership, because of Kent State and downtown.
It took Kent 100 years to realize they had a university. And, and I think too, when I was a kid growing up, you could still drive from Main Street to Summit Street by driving through the university. And I can remember when when we'd have the relatives from Bel Air come up, my one uncle had graduated from Kent State. It was a tradition on Sunday afternoon to pile into the car and drive through the campus to see what was being built that was new, because in the 60s there was construction everywhere. And there was an incredible sense of pride in the campus. And I think after 1970, the Student Center was built, the library was built, the science buildings, they were all built on Summit Street. They were built as far away from downtown as you could get. And then adding insult to injury, you had the bypass, which literally cut off one side of Kent from another. The bypass, I think, is an incredible public improvement, which I still don't think was necessary. It was like, we're tired of being stopped by the trains. Well, by the time the bypass was dedicated, there were no passenger trains. There was a limited number of freight trains. And you had this big gash from one end of Kent to the other. They destroyed a working class neighborhood. It led to the demise of those factories that ended up under the bridge. It's funny, as I was thinking, one of the reasons that my grandfather moved from Summit Street to quote unquote way out of nowhere on the west side was because even in 1949 there was talk of building a bridge. He told my grandmother, if we're living on the bridge, we're never going to sell this house. And so they moved. But I think the bypass,
When did the bypass,
1974, 75.
74, 75?
Yeah. And what's funny is when they dedicated it, there was a train that was on the tracks underneath it. But, there was a great cost. And, I don't think there was any environmental studies on it. When I drive on it now, when the bypass was completed but not open, that used to be kind of the big dare game. It's like, I drove on the bypass and didn't get caught. You had the bypass, you also had 261, which is a road to nowhere. And it was kind of like, we've got state money and we're going to build this thing. When I drive on it now, I see all those trees and all those shrubs, and that was Ruth Meade in KEC. And I remember Ruth calling me, and I ended up on that committee. And she goes, I've already talked to ODOT about taking that horrible fence down. She goes, that's even worse than the Iron Curtain. And they said no. And Ruth had a real raspy voice. She goes, I've just decided I'm going to plant so many trees, flowers, and shrubs you're not even going to see that thing. And she did. And that was all volunteers because there was no money for landscaping. And we did like fundraising drives for about 4 years. I've got like 4 trees there for my various relatives. But again, KC is wonderful too.
So here you are in 2019.
Yeah.
And we have a paper. It is still called the Record Courier.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not the same thing that you worked in for 40 years. How do you see what is happening now?
I think we're seeing the deliberate destruction of a small town newspaper. Even when I worked there, we basically wrote off the first 3 months of the year that we just didn't turn a profit. And being part of a small family-owned syndicate, they made ends meet by shifting from, the fat years to the lean years, and kept it running. And a big part of that was the Dixons were proud of what they did, and they felt they had a responsibility to bring the news to Kent. I remember at one point they were going to pull the plug on the Monday edition, which was typically maybe like 12 or 9% paid, and the rest was non-advertising. They're going to pull the plug on the Monday edition, and we were ready with the news release, and the corporate board stopped David and said, no, we want you to be a 7-day paper. It's important. You're a university town. You can't give up a day. And I think that was their commitment. The Dixons also were part of the community. Bob was on the board of trustees at Kent State for over 40 years. His brother preceded him, and David succeeded him. Helen was very much a part of the community. They basically, it was their business. They were into it to make a profit, which they did, but they also worked. They were on call 24/7. I was on call 24/7. It wasn't unusual to go in and work on a Sunday, and the idea of it's my day off, well, that just didn't cut it. So I think you had a philosophy that was very different, and it was a love of news, but it was the idea we have a responsibility. If we're not here, nobody's going to know what's being reported. I laugh. Early on, I took a phone call when I was a reporter, and it was a lady that just wanted to talk about the paper, and she had an issue, and I was in the mood to listen, and she was so funny. She goes, you know what I really like best about your paper? And it's like, what? She goes, you print news nobody cares about. And she meant it as a compliment. And it was, what we printed, the Beacon didn't print because it wasn't important to them. But I think printing news that nobody cares about is what kept the Courier in business. I used to love to, be somewhere and see somebody buying a Courier from a rack. And I had no problems of stopping somebody and saying, hey, thank you, I'm the editor, why are you buying the paper? And, and people were nice, generally. But I think that's lost. I think you lost the nature of the paper when you sold it to a conglomerate. It was one thing to see my boss, who was the owner of the paper, every day, and to be able to talk to him, and he was able to talk to any reporter. And what's funny is we always called him David. I called him Mr. Dix once, and he looked at me and goes, that's my father. I'm David. As opposed to, with Gatehouse, where I literally didn't know who I was working for. And nobody knows who. And now it's Gatehouse Gannett, and it's even bigger. I think that's what's made a difference. I think a large corporation, as opposed to a family entity, is strictly about the bottom line. Nobody likes to lose money, but if you are part of a $1 billion holding company, it's no big deal to say, we're just going to get rid of you. And that's my greatest fear. It's like I'm grateful I wasn't the last editor of the Record Courier. This person has that title now. But I was the editor for longer than anybody else. And that's, I was the editor for 26 years.
Anything else? Well, I think we covered most everything we had
Great.
talked about. Was there anything else?
I got one thing.
Yes.
Sure, Henry.
If you would, I want you possibly, if you can, project the next 25 years of Kent. What do you see happening in the city itself? I mean, you have the history to reflect on, and if you were to prognosticate,
I think you would be talking about Kent State marking the 75th anniversary of May 4th. By then, May 4th would be very much acknowledged as history. Kent State will have continued to grow. They'll continue to diversify. The campus will get bigger. I think the city, I think the downtown area will continue to be strong because they made sustainability a big part of that plan. It is a plan downtown. They wanted it to be walkable. They wanted it to be family friendly. They didn't want it to be a bunch of bars or tattoo shops. They wanted a diversity of businesses. They very smartly decided, well, we're going to lure industrial magnates there like Ametek and Davy Tree and Smithers, and they're going to be on the second and third floors of those buildings, which means that when the storefronts get vacant, as they inevitably do, you still got those corporate tenants that are going to be there. And I think that made for a much stronger downtown. One of the other things, too, is you now have a residential downtown, which never in the history of Kent did you have people living there. I don't know if it was zoned out, but you didn't even have apartments. I had friends that went to Miami and they lived downtown above storefronts in Oxford. The same thing in Athens. You had students living downtown. When you have people living downtown, you have critical mass. That's the thing that Ravenna has always had over Kent with the riddle blocks. So I think you're going to have a downtown that's going to be still going to be strong. You're going to have a university that's going to be growing. I think in terms of residential, I think we're pretty much about built out. And I think it's a big challenge because the homes that were built after the war are now 70 years old. There are neighborhoods on the west side where I grew up that are pretty dilapidated. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for the future councils. They're going to have to put some money into residential rehabilitation. And there are weak spots. The west side of Kent is very weak. The late Dr. Jim Koch talked about in the 1970s. He said that Route 59 was from east to west a vista of corporate gloom. Because it's ugly, especially the west side. It looks terrible. And, that's the way that blight begins, when nobody does anything and you tear buildings down.
Right.
And there are vacancies. So I think that's a major, major challenge. But I think, I think the city and the university have finally made peace. And I will give Dave Ruller and Lester Left and all the credit in the world for that, where they decided we can't be separate, and the only way we're going to grow is if we grow together. And I think that's, and the passing of time puts May 4th into perspective. For the longest time when I was covering the university and covering May 4th, university administrators did everything in their power to kind of ignore it. And the gym was literally built to bury it. One of the things that I am hoping, I don't know if I'll live to see it, I hope to see that gym torn down. I've never set foot in it.
Wow.
It wasn't necessary. It was underbuilt. There's no question that it destroyed the May 4th site. They've torn down buildings that were even younger than that. They tore down Small Group. They tore down Terrace Hall. The gym is closing in on being, 45 years old. They could dump that and there would be no loss. But, I think looking ahead for 50 years or 25 years, I think I'm optimistic for Kent. I think
The Esplanade is,
the Esplanade I think what it is in the last 10 years, Kent saved itself because it couldn't continue to deteriorate. And, and the Puffer Belly or Trano, that's another thing too, is that was a historical society saying this shall not stand. And you see it like a build-up of community. You see the farmer's market. I mean, that didn't exist when I was a kid. And it's like it's people that make it a place to go. It's a place to meet people. It's, But so I think, 25 years from now, which I doubt I'll see, I think Kent's going to be a pretty strong place. Good question.
very good question. Thank you so much,
Well,
Roger.
thank you. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Good.